intensify. 25,000 killed and counting there, while the Israeli military claims to have encircled the southern city of Khan Younes. It's also burying its dead this Tuesday after its deadliest firefights since October 7th. We'll hear reactions to the 21 reservists killed. For Israel's prime minister, it's all happening as he faces the wrath of families of hostages. They want their loved ones home safe. And as U.S. and European allies dial up pressure to do what Benjamin Netanyahu has always resisted, work towards an actual two-state solution with the Palestinians. This is also about political survival. Netanyahu faces a reckoning over security lapses on his watch when the fighting ends, not to mention 3 corruption cases. For Israel, more broadly, it's also about a shattered sense of invincibility. For ordinary Palestinians, well, it's just a nightmare. How to end this cycle of death today in the France 24 debate. What exit strategy? Joining us from Tel Aviv, he's a former Israeli ambassador to the United States, Itamar Rabinovich, founder and president of the Israel Institute's think tank. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much. Nice to be with you.
From Washington, he's a former advisor to Palestinian negotiators with Israel, Khaled El-Gindi, director of the Palestine and Palestinian-Israeli Affairs program at the Middle East Institute. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
From Jerusalem, France 24 correspondent Iris Maklar. How are things, Iris?
Holding up here.
All right. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation, you have on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The hashtag is F24debate. Both sides reeling. Israel from Monday's RPG strike on one of its positions. Palestinians from the encirclement of Khan Younes, with the UN Relief Agency describing terrified civilians trapped in one hospital targeted by gunfire. James Mulholland has more.
Scenes of grief as comrades and loved ones mourn the death of an army reservist, killed in action on the deadliest day so far of Israel's offensive in Gaza. Hundreds turned out here in Jerusalem and more in Tel Aviv as funerals began for the 24 soldiers killed. Israel's defense minister said the deaths were a heavy blow.
We share and express deep sorrow with the families. We continue at this time in the spirit of the fallen to complete the tasks and do everything that is required.
Israel said 21 reservists died near the Israeli border town of Kisufim, where an enemy munition hit a nearby tank, triggering explosives they'd been preparing. 3 more soldiers were killed in a separate attack. Over 220 Israeli troops have now lost their lives since the offensive began on the 7th of October. The Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry said at least 190 people were killed in the preceding 24 hours, with strikes reported on the Al-Nasser hospital in Khan Younes, one of a dwindling number left in the Strip.
14 partially functioning hospitals, 7 in the north and 7 in the south, and with 2 minimal functioning ones. Al-Qir, which is one of the 2 hospitals that is now being raided, and the Nasser hospital, which is basically sieged around the hospital.
The United Nations says more than 500,000 people, a quarter of Gaza's population, are starving.
Itamar Rabinovich, you've known previous wars. The mood after this toll that was described there in that report, how does it compare?
It's different. It's unlike any other war. It's not the conventional wars that we used to have once with Arab states. It's not exactly the same hybrid war that we had in Lebanon in 2006. It's different. It has lasted much longer than expected. There is no clear military victory in sight. There is a debate in the country and inside the emergency cabinet on the strategy to be followed. As you indicated earlier, the Prime Minister is besieged internationally and domestically by opposition and protest. And people just are confused. People ask themselves, okay, this is a huge number of casualties, very difficult to take, but to what end? What is the exit strategy? Where do we want to end? And of course, the endless debate on the day after in Gaza. How will Gaza be administered and governed when this is hopefully all over?
Iris Makler, can you confirm to us that there is this sense that over in the Gaza Strip in the last couple of days, it's really gotten more intense around Khan Younes?
It certainly has gotten more intense around Khan Younes. I can say that from all that I've been reading and seeing and the people I've been speaking to. And Israel says, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, say they've encircled Khan Younes. Tonight, they say they found the largest tunnel system so far. If they are right in what they have been saying, that this is the place where Yahya Sinwar and his brother had set themselves up, the town that they were born in. If that's right, perhaps that would explain. I must say, I've been seeing pictures of tunnels all along, and this one does look very sophisticated and very large. Nevertheless, what we're also seeing is civilians leaving Khan Younes, because the areas of Khan Younes where the fighting was taking place, it's now expanded westwards, and those civilians are leaving. Those who can leave, the others, of course, are going to hospitals. So it's, I just want to say one thing. It's a simple thing. It's a weather-related thing, but it's really cold tonight. It's really wet. And I've been thinking about the Palestinians in Gaza, in those tents outside. I've been thinking about Israelis who are in tents outside the Prime Minister's residence, because they are related to the hostages being held inside the Gaza Strip, and they want to be outside, and they want this to be on the Prime Minister's mind the whole time. It's just a very, very long story, and a story full of sorrow and hardship.
Khaled El-Gindi, is there any light at the end of the tunnel at this point?
If there is, I certainly don't see it. I think, as we heard in the report, the Israeli public, certainly the Israeli government, still has quite an appetite to continue this horrific war, which is ultimately unwinnable, and has already only brought mass death and destruction to Gaza. And as we have heard, Israel has no exit strategy. I think the words of the Israeli leadership very early on, that this was a war that was not about precision, but was about damage. And we are seeing that play out. I'm not sure that having an exit strategy is even in the cards, because this was never really about destroying Hamas, which I think most people understand is not achievable, but was really about, I think, punishing Palestinians in Gaza collectively as some form of deterrent, perhaps in the minds of Israeli military and political leaders. And so that's why we are seeing, as a matter of Israeli policy, mass starvation being used as a weapon of war. And again, I think it's unfortunate that the United States and other Western powers have encouraged this unwinnable war. But here we are.
All right, but the tide may be turning, or the time may soon be up, it seems. On Monday, EU foreign ministers meeting in Brussels heard separately from both the Israeli and Palestinian foreign ministers. Israel Katz, the top diplomat in Israel, offered up an unlikely day-after solution: the building of an artificial island off Gaza to house the territory's 2 million inhabitants, an idea that, according to the Irish Times, triggered discomfort among his audience.
As I said, the Israeli minister presented his plans for artificial islands off the coast of Gaza and his plan for a rail connection with India. And apparently, he'd already thought about these some 7 years ago. So this didn't have much to do with what we were discussing.
Itamar Rabinovich, is that a way to subtly tell European foreign ministers, stay out of our business?
No, I think there's a lot of confusion here. Mr. Katz, this is not a novel idea of his. He proposed it a few years ago. The idea is not to settle Gazans there. The idea is to build a port and to relieve some of the pressure. If we can forget the war for for a moment and ask how can 2.2 million people live in that small territory, then building artificial islands would also relieve the population pressure, but primarily provide the city with a safe harbor. So that's of course not an issue for tomorrow morning. That's an issue for hopefully several years down the road. The idea of a rail link with India actually came from Washington, from President Biden, that sort of a strategic overview of the whole region. So all these issues became confused, and they have very little to do with not just the day after, but this day. It's not going to resolve the issue. The way to come out of this war is indeed to have a regional solution, to install the Palestinian Authority in Gaza as the governing and administrative authority, to bring in aid from the Gulf, to normalize Israeli relations with Saudi Arabia, and of course to restart the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations with the prospect of two-state solution. I'm saying prospect. It's not feasible for tomorrow morning, but it needs to be on the table as a prospect. That is the way to devise a regional and international solution to the problem. And let's remember, Iran is a player. It is the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza, but a major actor is Iran. Let's remember, Iran just fired missiles into Pakistan and threatened to fire missiles anywhere, as visions of or delusions of grandeur. So any solution to the problem cannot stop in Gaza. It also has to deal with the regional challenge of Iran.
All right. For the time being, Israel also conveying the suggestion of a 2-month ceasefire, an idea conveyed through Qatari and Egyptian mediators. According to news website Axios, a 2-month ceasefire. Khaled El-Gindi, your thoughts on that?
I mean, anything that brings even a temporary pause to the death and destruction that we're seeing daily is a good thing. Certainly 2 months is longer than any pause that we've seen discussed before. The question in my mind is this a pause that will allow some space for a diplomatic process, for a political process beyond the military campaign? Is it, in other words, a way to climb down from the zero-sum perch that the Israeli leadership has climbed up, and a way to end the war without declaring victory on one hand or declaring a ceasefire on the other? Or is it simply a way to allow Israel to regroup and continue the war after 2 or 3 months indefinitely? I think that's an open question. I certainly hope it is the former. I hope that if there is such a pause, that the United States in particular will use that opportunity to convince the Israelis of what most of us in the analyst community have been saying for some time, and that is there is no military solution to this situation, even with regard to Hamas, and that there is only a political solution. But it remains to be seen what the actual intention is, or even if this pause happens.
There was a pause early in the fighting, Iris Makler. Listening to Khaled El-Gindi present the two options, what is it looking like?
I think there's an enormous amount of pressure on the government to do something about the hostage situation. And it is now being said more openly, not by the politicians yet, or not by the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister, but we are hearing from other analysts and other politicians that really the two aims, the two stated war aims of removing Hamas's control in the Gaza Strip and returning the hostages, they're no longer compatible. And you actually might have to choose one. You have to give a priority to one of them. And there's an enormous amount of pressure from the families of the hostages, from the hostages who have returned. You know, you see them not just sleeping outside the Prime Minister's office. We saw them today breaking into the Parliament. They broke into the Parliament, into the Finance Committee yesterday. They were invited into the Parliament today. People who had returned, women who had returned, describing the situation of women there. It was incredibly disturbing to listen to. The suggestion was that they are being raped. One woman said she had seen them dressed. They had provided them with the clothes that made them look like dolls, you know, so they could be their puppets. She said, you have to get those young women out of there. It was very, very difficult to listen to. The pain in their voices is incredible. And I think that pressure is starting to mount. So if it is, as the analysts are suggesting, a choice between freeing the hostages and removing Hamas's control in the Gaza Strip, and you have to choose, I think now there is a mounting feeling within Israel that the hostages must come first because they haven't got time.
Yeah,
There's more time for Hamas.
We started to see it late last week, that domestic pressure. The same hostage families who've staged sit-ins, as you say, in front of the Prime Minister's residence, bursting into Parliament on Monday to interrupt that Finance Committee meeting. Their growing desperation fueled by the blunt remarks late last week by the former Army Chief of Staff, Gadi Eisenkot. Today, he's a member of that coalition war cabinet. Eisenkot, who lost a son in the fighting, telling Israeli TV station Channel 12, you can't have it both ways, total victory over Hamas and the rescue of hostages.
It's impossible to return the hostages alive in the near future without a deal. And whoever is saying that to the public is selling lies.
Is the peace camp reading too much into this interview, Iris Makler, or did it really have an impact?
I think it did have an impact. He's a bereaved father. He's a former chief of staff. And when you saw that interview, actually, I think I agree with the Israeli analyst who said he was just all there for you. You know, it was an honest account of the political situation as he sees it. And it's such a relief in Israeli political terms to hear someone telling you the truth. It almost felt unusual. So I think it was partly an emotional response to a grieving father, and it was also partly his honest political assessment. He didn't pull any punches, and he seemed very trustworthy. So it was a very strong interview. It was reported everywhere, not just on the channel that ran it, and it's been reported for the past 3 or 4 days. So yes, I would say it had a great impact.
And he made it clear that it was going to be the liberation of hostages, not total victory of Hamas. That would be the end game.
No, what he said was this: you're not going to have them both. And the liberation of hostages, it's not going to be Entebbe. You know, it's not going to be that memory of the Ugandan rescue back in the 1970s. There's hundreds of kilometres of tunnels underneath the earth. And by the time any Israeli soldiers would get them, the hostages would be dead. So what he is saying is this: it's a question of priorities. And his priority, as he sees it, and I think it's the reason he was making it clear that he's staying in this government, his priority is the safe return of the hostages, because that is more urgent. And you can deal with Hamas, you know, in 2 years' time. There won't be hostages left to deal with in 2 years' time. And I think the fact that he said it was plain that that was why he was staying in this government, to try and push that position. And so I think you felt, as a viewer, you were listening to an honest man with the national interest at heart.
Itamar Rabinovich, your reaction to that interview?
I agree. General Mr. Eisenkot is the most popular and the most trusted politician in Israel today. I mean, he's in politics. He's not really a politician. He's very credible. He carries a lot of weight, very persuasive. And he also holds the key. He and Mr. Gantz could at any moment leave this emergency coalition government. If they do that, this would be I think the beginning of another manifestation of the protest movement. People are hesitant now about starting a protest against the government in the middle of a war. But the moment that Mr. Eisenkot and his partner, Mr. Gantz, decide to leave the government would be a sign to the public, to the opposition, to the protest movement to go out to the streets, even though a war is still going on. So he is in a very key position.
What would it take for Gadi Eisenkot and Benny Gantz to leave that war cabinet government?
An exacerbation of their dilemma. The dilemma is that they feel very awkward being partners in a coalition with some extreme right-wing partners, sometimes bordering on hallucinatory politics. They are very uncomfortable. At the same time, they know that as long as they are in the government, they can exercise a moderating influence. It's a very difficult dilemma to live with. So far, they've decided to stay, but at some point, it just could become too much for them, and they may decide to leave, knowing full well that this would mark the beginning of a massive popular protest against the government.
Khalid El-Gindi, are they better in or out of the government?
I mean, that's a question. Personally, I think we're unlikely to see a change in this government until after this war is finished. I think Netanyahu needs this war to continue for as long as he possibly can, for the reasons that were already stated, for his own political survival. And I think there is enough consensus inside the war cabinet to continue this war on existing terms. The question is, can outside actors like the United States change those calculations that Israel is not going to achieve its war aims, that the hostages will not be returned unless there is a negotiation. I mean, we know the only time that hostages have been released has been through diplomacy, has been when there was a brief 1-week pause back in November. And so, if that is a goal, then there needs to be much more greater pressure, I think, from the outside more than the inside, to compel this Israeli leadership to change its calculations.
And again, who holds the key? Because we talked earlier about the growing voices within the European Union, and we know that as we're speaking, Joe Biden's envoy is meeting with Qatari and Egyptian mediators. Where's the key lie there?
Well, I think the key lies in Washington, which is where it has always been. As far as, the United States is the only party that can convince the Israelis, that the Israelis trust enough to make these kinds of bold decisions. The problem has been that the Biden administration, for the most part, particularly the president himself, has been more or less in a similar state of mind as the Israeli leadership. As far as the stated war aims, as far as the kind of inability to empathize with Palestinian suffering, the inability even to see the long-term damage that is being done to American interests and to regional stability. It's actually mind-boggling to me that anybody thinks that the destruction of Gaza, the killing of 25 to 30,000 people, the killing of 11,000 children, the destruction of whole neighborhoods and towns inside Gaza, the displacement of 90% of the population, starvation, suffering, that this would somehow bring security to anyone is absolutely mind-boggling. But I do think the administration is getting tired. And they've been wanting to see an increase in humanitarian aid. They've been wanting to see fewer civilian casualties. They have not gotten those. They've wanted to see an exit strategy. They have not gotten that. So there is growing frustration, but it hasn't risen to the level where the president is prepared to expend political capital in trying to twist some arms in the Israeli leadership.
Khaled, we're speaking on the day of the New Hampshire primary, the one of the big kickoffs of the presidential election race. So What happens? How much political capital? What kind of political capital are you expecting from Joe Biden?
I think every day that we get deeper into the election cycle, and we're now at the beginning of it, I think every day that goes by, there's less and less political will to expend that kind of political capital. I think the hope in the administration is that the Israeli leadership will come to these conclusions on their own. We have not seen evidence of that. I think the 2-month pause initiative is a way to allow everyone to climb down from this maximalist perch that they've been in, including the president. And so it would buy him some breathing room, some space to allow for a diplomatic process. But if we're going to continue in zero-sum terms, in the terms that Netanyahu is talking about, that total destruction and will continue regardless, then I'm afraid the Biden administration will sadly acquiesce in that sort of a process, even against their own better judgment.
Itamar Rabinovich, you agree?
No, I don't. I think that we had an experience in 1974 as the Nixon administration was declining and coming to an end. Actually, Nixon was completely neutralized and had to resign in the early summer of 1974. And his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, was in a way implementing diplomatic miracles in ending the 73 war and beginning the Egyptian-Israeli peace process, making a disengagement agreement between Israel and Syria. All of this during the turmoil in Washington and the decline of the Nixon administration. So one can have a very intense political season in Washington and can have active, effective diplomacy in the Middle East. That in itself need not be the issue. And of course, the administration is still hoping that at the end of all of this, there would be a spectacular, or at least an impressive, diplomatic achievement if normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel can finally be achieved. This would be a big victory for the administration. Let's remember that the Saudi foreign minister announced in Davos the other day that this was still on the table. So we are in the middle of a brutal war. Peace and diplomatic achievement do not seem to be imminent, but they can yet be achieved.
The Saudis who've shown restraint on what's happening across the Red Sea and with the Houthis in Yemen hitting commercial shipping. We've seen a gradual stepping up of U.S. and UK-led strikes against the Houthis. At what point does it become untenable for the Saudis to show that restraint and to leave that door open with Israel?
Well, the Saudis are not exactly saddened by the fact that the United States and Great Britain are taking on the Houthis. I mean, they tried it themselves, not because of shipping, but because of the significance of Yemen to Saudi Arabia and to the whole region in the Arabian Peninsula, and they and the Emiratis failed. So now to watch the United States and Great Britain taking the Houthis on, doesn't exactly antagonize the Saudis, I think.
How's it being felt where you are, Khaled El-Gindi?
Well, in Washington, obviously, there's a vast range of views. I mean, I think a lot of people are saying, the one thing this administration has been keen to prevent is an escalation or expansion of this war beyond Gaza, and we're already seeing that now. And the United States is actively involved, perhaps not in a declared war. Not on the scale of what we're seeing certainly in Gaza, but they have been drawn in the same way that many had feared they would. And so it's a question of at what point do people realize that there is diminishing returns, that things only escalate more from here, and that the United States also doesn't really have an exit strategy of its own. In this, it does not have any sort of any way to climb down from the corner that they've kind of painted them, they've painted themselves into this corner. So it has become a self-fulfilling prophecy, this expansion of the war beyond the Gaza theater. And, it's striking to me that people don't realize every time there is an action, there are consequences when you attack Houthis. I mean, we know the reason that Houthis are attacking. It has everything to do with what's happening in Gaza. If there were a ceasefire in Gaza, there would be an end to the attacks on shipping, regardless of what we think they're how terrible they are. But we know there's cause and effect, and yet we're acting as though our actions are happening in a vacuum.
Yeah, and the Saudis making it clear, because the U.S. has been working on a plan to get the Gulf states to help rebuild Gaza, making it clear that there won't be any such talk as long as the fighting goes on, and as long as there's not a firm commitment by Israel to a two-state solution. And we've seen the last couple of days kind of a fraught to and fro between Netanyahu and the White House. Him and Joe Biden speaking for the first time in more than 3 weeks, but still, the Israeli Prime Minister reiterating his stance.
As Prime Minister of Israel, I firmly stood by this position in the face of great international and internal pressures. My insistence is what prevented for years the establishment of a Palestinian state, which would have posed an existential danger to Israel. As long as I am Prime Minister, I will continue to firmly stand by it. If someone has a different position, let them show leadership and state their position honestly to the citizens of Israel.
Iris Makler, what do the polls say? Is he speaking for the majority of Israelis there?
It's a very interesting question. There was a lot of criticism because actually over this weekend of this backwards and forwards, you're actually talking about the Prime Minister of Israel having a public spat with Israel's largest ally, its biggest financial supporter, its biggest military supporter, its biggest supporter in the United Nations. And a number of opposition politicians were saying, if you want to have that spat, have it privately. Otherwise, this just looks like electioneering. It looks like you playing to your base. And at the moment, his base, or rather the poll figures, don't show that this is very popular. There was the poll figures have been bad for him all along, because I think the shock of October the 7th was so huge for Israelis, still reverberating throughout Israeli society, I think. So the shock of that attack was so large that the dip in popularity of the man who sold himself as Mr. Security, so the dip in popularity has been huge. And there was a poll just the other day, and people asked, do you believe Benjamin Netanyahu is acting in the national interest, or is he acting in his own personal interest? And 53% of people said they thought he was acting in his own personal interest. So more than half of the population doesn't believe he has the national interest at heart. And I think that's what makes the next step so complicated. Not only that he has his own very complicated, very extremist right-wing coalition that he's clinging to so that he'll stay in office, but also because the public, I don't think, really can rely on him to do the negotiation that's necessary for the hostages, for the day after in Gaza, not to mention, of course, the larger picture of what happens. Could there be some kind of peace process? Can you turn this crisis into this catastrophe into an opportunity? I don't even talk about the big picture, just the next 2 or 3 steps. If the public doesn't believe that he's acting in their interest, then he hasn't got the mandate to take many steps at all, actually.
Yeah, but Itamar Rabinovich, let's go over the words that we just heard. And you, earlier in this conversation, stated your support for a two-state solution. The Prime Minister saying, if someone has a different position, let them show leadership and state their position honestly to the citizens of Israel. That sounds like a man who thinks he's got the backing of the majority of the people.
Not really. This is electioneering. I mean, there will be an election in Israel probably a few months from now. People are speaking about maybe September as an agreed date for election. And Netanyahu is, of course, catering to the right-wing base, but the decisive element would be what the strategists here call the soft right wing, And in order to win, the opposition needs to win the soft right wing, and it is therefore very careful in formulating a position on the issue of a Palestinian state. And of course, in the middle of a war, the Israeli public becomes more hawkish when it comes to elections. It's going to be different. The polls, of course, indicate at this point that the opposition is going to win the elections handily, but we know that the polls are one thing and the actual election would be another. So, and Netanyahu is catering to his own right-wing base and to that 10-15% of soft right-wing who will, in fact, decide the next election, as they have the few recent or two frequent elections that we had in the last 5 years.
You personally, when you state your preference for a two-state solution, you don't feel a little bit lonely?
No, I don't. But as I said myself, the two-state solution is not for tomorrow morning. I think we are not ready. The Palestinian Authority needs to undergo its own reform. I think we are looking at that a few years down the road. But in order to enable the Arab world to participate in building a new regional order, Israel has to agree to put back, I mean, as Netanyahu himself did during the Obama administration in the famous Bar Ilan speech, when he spoke about his acceptance of the two-state solution. He only needs to pick it up again. He said it once, he can say it again, but, you know, even without him, the idea should be there as a prospect for a few years down the road. And what the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority need to do now is to resume negotiations. There can be an interim agreement that can be negotiated. The rough drafts of such an agreement are quite easy to see. And a return to diplomacy, a reform of the current Palestinian Authority would be very important. Now, a word about Hamas. You know, we heard from Khalid al-Gindi a lot about the suffering of the Gaza people. We have to realize Hamas is not a movement. Hamas was the government and Gaza was a state. 2.2 million with an army of 30,000, and Mr. Sinwar was the head of state. What did he imagine when he launched his attack on the 7th and perpetrated all these atrocities? What did he expect the ramifications for his own people in Gaza to be? And can Hamas and can that leadership remain in power in a position of influence in the future? And does he accept the principle of a two-state solution? Does Hamas accept the idea of Jewish sovereignty in Israel? They do not. So it's much more complicated than meets the eye.
Yeah, on Sunday, Hamas put out a 16-page statement, both in English and Arabic. It justified the October 7th attacks and acknowledged mistakes. Some faults happened due to the rapid collapse of the Israeli security and military system and the chaos caused along the border areas with Gaza. End quote. Khalid al-Gindi, to answer Itamar Rabinovich, first off, what do you make of the timing of this statement? What's that statement all about?
Well, I mean, I can't know, obviously, what is going on internally, the thinking within the Hamas leadership. But, you know, the timing is not all that great from their standpoint, because it's coming now 3.5 months after October 7th. And whatever explanations they have, whether they're factual or not, aren't going to matter at this point, as far as certainly not Israeli public opinion, but even global opinion in general. I think it's important for them to put it out for the record. And
was it, sorry to interrupt, was it directed more domestically or at the world, that statement? I
think it was directed at both. But again, it's kind of 3.5 months too late to have any serious impact on you know, international public opinion, and so it may also serve domestic purposes as well. I mean, Hamas has already increased its popularity quite significantly since October 7th. This may be a way also to add to that, to show that, you know, all of these horror stories that you've heard are not true, or to somehow try to put them in context. I don't know. I don't think that they're going to have. I don't think it's going to have much impact one way or the other. And the fact that it took so long, I think maybe has to do with they're not in a position, right? They have other priorities. They have other things to deal with than simply trying to correct the narrative. But Ambassador Rabinovich raises some good points about Hamas. I think there may be a reckoning internally about Hamas's decision making, what prompted it to carry out this attack on October 7th, and of course, everyone knows that whatever the intention was on October 7th, that there would be some kind of Israeli response. I do think the Israeli response that we've seen so far has gone far beyond anything that could be legitimately called self-defense. Just massive killing and massive destruction, almost for their own sake. But that said, there may come a time when Palestinians say, well, Hamas's decision making was flawed and it brought this calamity. In the same way that Israelis will hold Netanyahu accountable eventually for his failures in leadership that led to October 7th. So blame and responsibility and accountability are a multifaceted thing, right? Even though you can blame more than one party at the same time. And so that may happen, but right now, Palestinians are not in the mood to engage in that kind of reflection because, particularly in Gaza, they're in survival mode. They're just simply trying to find a safe place to spend the night where they're not going to be bombed, where they can find food and so forth. And Palestinians as a whole are deeply, deeply traumatized. We saw the report about how 24 soldiers killed in a single day is traumatic for Israelis. And of course, October 7th was deeply traumatic in ways that will continue to reverberate for a long time. So now imagine many, many orders of magnitude greater trauma and death and destruction. And that trauma is real and will last for generations, and it will fuel more violence. That's the fundamental calculation that isn't being made in Israel. The last thing I'll say is Hamas, as we said, is not going to be destroyed. It will play a role in Palestinian politics, and that's just an inevitability. It's not something. It's not up to me whether I like it or not, or it's not up to the Israeli political and military leadership. It is a political fact of life. The question is, what kind of Hamas will emerge out of this? Will it be more radicalized? Will it be more pragmatic? We don't know. What kind of new leadership will come out? What kind of soul searching will happen, if any? But we do know that Hamas will remain a part of the Palestinian political fabric. And I'm sorry to disagree with Ambassador Rabinovich, but Gaza was not a state. Gaza had no sovereignty. Gaza was under Israeli control by air, land, and sea at every stage. The blockade Israel controlled. At a certain point, they were even counting the number of calories that Palestinians in Gaza were required to consume without dying. They controlled the population registry, as we've seen. They were able to turn on and off the electricity and water. So Gaza was not an independent state. It was, in fact, suffering under a blockade. That blockade and that suffering does not justify the atrocities that were committed on October 7th, but it is a crucial part of the context that needs to be understood. History did not begin on October 7th. This is a 56-year occupation.
Very briefly, Tamar.
Gaza also has a border with Egypt. Let's remember that.
Last question, Iris Makler, very briefly, because we're out of time.
Yes, we are.
It's day 100 and something, and we're on an international news channel talking about an exit strategy, something that you've reported is not happening much in Israel. Is it happening any more, though, than it was a couple of months back?
There is a discussion and the need for a discussion because, in a way, the military says we're pulling out. And so it's back up to the politicians. And it's not something Benjamin Netanyahu wants to discuss. He's made that plain. But I think in the end, when the military pulls out, there will have to be a discussion about what comes next, because people are going to try and go home to whatever homes are left. So I think planning would be better, obviously, but Netanyahu doesn't want to have to deal with his right-wing coalition. So perhaps I would say this eternal war suits him nicely.
Iris Makler, many thanks for joining us from Jerusalem. I want to thank Itamar Rabinovich for being with us from Tel Aviv. Khaled El-Gindi in Washington, thank you for being with us here in the France 24.